There's something about the stillness of a spring night that makes you feel safe. The kind of quiet that settles over small-town America when families tuck themselves into bed, when porch lights flicker off one by one, when the only sounds left are crickets chirping and the occasional car passing down a sleepy street. It's the kind of peace that makes you believe the world is good, that your home is your sanctuary, that the people you love will wake up beside you in the morning. On the night of May 16, 2005, in a modest home along the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene in Idaho, the Groene family went to bed believing in that safety. Brenda Groene, a 40-year-old single mother, had finally found happiness with her boyfriend Mark Mackenzie. Her 3 children, 13-year-old Slade, 9-year-old Dylan, and 8-year-old Shasta, were everything to her. They were a blended family trying to make it work, trying to build something beautiful in their little corner of Idaho. They had no idea that someone had been watching them. They had no idea that evil had already chosen them. 2 days later, on May 18, family members arrived at the Groene home for a planned visit. When no one answered the door, they felt that familiar flutter of worry in their chests. Something wasn't right. They knocked again. Silence. They tried the door and it opened. What they found inside that house would haunt them for the rest of their lives, would scar an entire community, would make national headlines and remind America that monsters don't just exist in nightmares. They walk among us. They study us. They wait for the perfect moment to strike. Brenda Groene was dead. Mark Mackenzie was dead. 13-year-old Slade Groene was dead. All 3 had been bludgeoned to death with such violence that the medical examiner would later struggle to describe the brutality. They had been bound with zip ties, rendered helpless, and then beaten with a hammer until there was nothing left but silence. And Dylan and Shasta, the 2 youngest children, were gone. Vanished. An Amber Alert screamed across Idaho, across the Pacific Northwest, across the nation. 2 children, just Bobby's really, were out there somewhere with whoever had done this unspeakable thing. For 47 days, investigators searched. For 47 days, volunteers combed forests and lakes and highways. For 47 days, Brenda's father, the children's grandfather, appeared on television begging for their safe return, his voice cracking with a grief so profound it hurt to witness. For 47 days, America held its breath and prayed for a miracle. And then, on July 2, 2005, at 2 o'clock in the morning, a waitress working the graveyard shift at a Denny's restaurant in Coeur d'Alene looked up from her order pad and froze. Sitting in a booth near the window was a little girl with a face she had seen plastered on missing person posters for over a month. The girl was thin, pale, haunted-looking, and sitting across from her was a man. A man with cold eyes and a calm demeanor, casually eating breakfast as if he hadn't just held 2 children captive in the Montana wilderness for nearly 7 weeks. The waitress, whose name was Amber Dean, didn't panic. She caught the eye of her manager, Linda Olson, who immediately recognized 8-year-old Shasta Groene. They called 911. They positioned themselves between the booth and the door, quietly blocking exits while appearing to go about their normal duties. And when police officers arrived, they found Joseph Edward Duncan III sitting there, almost as if he had been waiting for them, almost as if some part of him wanted to be caught. Shasta was alive. She was traumatized beyond measure, but she was alive. Dylan, however, would never come home. This is the story of one of the most depraved serial killers in American history, a man who spent decades hunting children, a man whose crimes spanned multiple states and multiple decades, a man who documented his own depravity on a public blog and still managed to evade justice until it was too late. This is the story of Joseph Edward Duncan III and the trail of shattered lives he left behind. To understand the horror of what happened to the Groene family, you need to understand who they were before Joseph Duncan entered their lives. Brenda Groene wasn't living some fairy tale existence. She was a real woman with real struggles, trying to do her best for her kids. She had been through a divorce. She worked hard. She pinched pennies, but she loved her children with a fierceness that anyone who knew her could see. Her home along Lake Coeur d'Alene wasn't fancy. It was a modest place, but it was theirs. Slade, her oldest at 13, was at that awkward age between childhood and adolescence. He was protective of his younger siblings, the kind of big brother who would tease Dylan and Shasta one minute and defend them the next. Dylan was 9 years old, full of energy and mischief, the kind of kid who couldn't sit still, who always had dirt under his fingernails from playing outside. And Shasta, the baby of the family at 8 years old, was sweet and shy, attached to her mother's hip, still young enough to believe that her mom could protect her from anything. Mark Mackenzie, Brenda's boyfriend, had become a fixture in their lives. He wasn't the children's biological father, but he cared about them. He showed up, he tried. The family had their ups and downs like any family, but they were together, and they were trying to build something stable. In the days leading up to May 16, life was normal. Slade was finishing up the school year. Dylan and Shasta were counting down the days until summer vacation. Brenda was working, managing the household, doing all the things that mothers do. There was nothing to suggest that danger was lurking. There was no warning sign, no ominous feeling, no chance to run. But someone was watching. Someone had been watching for weeks. Joseph Duncan had driven through Coeur d'Alene in his stolen rental car, a red Jeep Cherokee with Missouri plates, and he had been hunting. That's the word he used later, hunting. He would drive through neighborhoods looking for potential victims, looking for families with children, looking for homes that were isolated enough, vulnerable enough. And when he saw the Groene family, when he saw Shasta and Dylan playing outside their home, something inside him clicked. He had found his targets. He spent days surveilling the house. He learned their routines. He watched when people came and went. He planned every detail of what he was going to do. And late on the night of May 15 or early on May 16, 2005, he made his move. What happened inside that house is almost too horrific to put into words, but it needs to be told because the world needs to understand what Joseph Duncan was capable of. Based on what investigators pieced together from Shasta's testimony and the crime scene evidence, most investigators agree that Duncan broke into the Groene home late Sunday night on May 15 or in the very early hours of Monday, May 16. He was armed with a shotgun. He wore black gloves. He moved through the house like a predator who had done this before, because he had. According to Shasta's account to police, her mother woke her up from her bedroom where she had been sleeping. Brenda called Shasta into the living room, and there he was. Joseph Duncan standing there with a gun, wearing those black gloves, his face cold and expressionless. He had already confronted the others in the house. He had zip ties, the kind you can't break no matter how hard you struggle. He bound Brenda's hands with nylon zip ties. He bound Mark's hands. He bound Slade's hands. He made them helpless, terrified, unable to fight back. He took Shasta and Dylan outside. This is the part that still haunts investigators, the part that shows just how calculated Duncan was. He didn't want the younger children to see what was about to happen, not because he cared about them, but because he needed them compliant. He needed them too scared to run, but not so traumatized that they became unmanageable. So he made them wait outside, placing them in his vehicle while he went back into the house. Shasta would later tell police that while she sat in that vehicle with her little brother, she heard screaming. She heard her mother's boyfriend Mark scream out. And then she saw something that no child should ever witness. Her older brother Slade, injured and bleeding, staggering away from the entrance to the home, trying to escape, trying to get help. But Duncan followed him. What Duncan did to those three people was brutal beyond comprehension. He beat them to death with a hammer. Brenda, the mother who would have done anything to save her children. Mark, who tried to fight back and couldn't. Slade, just a boy, just 13 years old, who died trying to get away. The medical examiner would later determine the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. But that clinical term doesn't capture the savagery, the overkill, the sheer violence that Duncan unleashed on three helpless, bound people. When it was over, when the house was silent except for the sound of Duncan's breathing, he went back outside. He put Shasta and Dylan into his stolen Jeep Cherokee. Duncan told them what he had done. He bragged about beating their family members to death with a hammer. He wanted them to know there was no escape, no rescue coming, that they belonged to him now. And he drove away into the night, taking them to a hell that would last 47 days. What happened to Shasta and Dylan Groene over those 7 weeks is the kind of nightmare that most people can't even fathom. Duncan drove them to remote campsites in western Montana, deep in the Lolo National Forest near St. Regis, places so isolated that you could scream and no one would hear you. According to Shasta's statements to investigators, they stayed at multiple campsites during their captivity, moving from location to location in areas that were virtually inaccessible, places where hikers didn't venture, places where he could do whatever he wanted without fear of being discovered. He kept the children bound, sometimes with ropes, sometimes with other restraints. Shasta told investigators that Duncan repeatedly essayed both her and her brother. He tortured them. He filmed and photographed what he was doing, documenting his crimes like some sick trophy collection. The videos and photographs that investigators later found on Duncan's belongings were so disturbing that FBI agents who had to review them required counseling afterward. The jury who saw the evidence during Duncan's federal trial, hardened people who thought they had seen everything, left the courtroom in tears. One video shown in court was 33 minutes long and depicted Duncan tormenting Dylan while the boy cried and begged him to stop. At one point in the video, Duncan could be heard saying chilling words. "The devil is here, boy, the devil himself. The devil likes to watch children suffer and cry." These weren't the words of someone struggling with mental illness. These were the words of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and enjoyed it. Duncan gave himself a nickname during this time. He told the children to call him Jet. It was almost like he was trying to create some twisted sense of normalcy, like they were on a camping trip together, like this was some kind of game. But there was nothing normal about it, nothing resembling a game. It was sustained, calculated torture of 2 children who had already watched their family die. And through it all, Shasta tried to protect her little brother. She was only 8 years old, but she became Dylan's shield however she could. She tried to keep him calm. She tried to tell him that everything was going to be okay even though she knew it wasn't. She became a mother, a protector, a warrior in a body that was still so small. She witnessed Duncan essaying her brother. She heard his cries, and she endured the same horrors herself. But Dylan wouldn't survive. The exact circumstances of Dylan's death have been reconstructed based on Shasta's testimony and evidence found at the scene. Duncan would later claim it was an accident, that a shotgun he kept stored in a plastic box in his Jeep went off while he was reaching for a beer, that the shot hit Dylan in the stomach, and he only finished the job to put the boy out of his misery. But based on what investigators could determine from Shasta's account and the physical evidence, this could imply Duncan's version was another lie in a lifetime of lies. Shasta told investigators she heard a loud boom and ran to find Dylan on the ground, screaming, bleeding from his stomach. Duncan had a sawed-off 12-gauge shotgun. According to what Shasta witnessed, he put the gun to Dylan's head and pulled the trigger. It didn't fire. Dylan, that 9-year-old boy who should have been home playing video games and riding his bike, begged Duncan not to kill him. He cried. He pleaded. And Duncan reloaded the shotgun, put it back to Dylan's head, and pulled the trigger again. This time it worked. Dylan Groene died instantly, execution style, in a remote Montana wilderness. Shasta said Duncan started crying after he killed her brother, telling her he only did it to end Dylan's suffering. But that's the thing about monsters, they always have an excuse. They always have a justification for the unjustifiable. The tears, if they were real, changed nothing. Dylan was dead, and Shasta was left alone with her brother's killer. Duncan buried Dylan's remains at that remote Montana campsite. He would be found weeks later by investigators using cadaver dogs and ground searches, after Duncan had already been arrested, after Shasta had already told them where to look. And at Dylan's memorial service, held on what would have been his 10th birthday on July 16, 2005. His family stood before a community in mourning and tried to find words for a loss that has no words. But Shasta was still alive, still captive, still enduring. In the days after Dylan's murder, according to what Shasta later revealed, Duncan came close to killing her too. He told her he was going to kill her and gave her a choice: strangulation or gunshot. Can you imagine being 8 years old and being asked to choose how you want to die? Shasta chose strangulation, maybe because she was scared of the gun after what she'd seen happen to Dylan, maybe because she thought it would be quicker. Duncan wrapped a rope around her neck and pulled it tight. She started suffocating, feeling the life drain out of her, the world going dark. And in a moment of desperation, she gasped out his nickname. "Jet, please stop." And he did. He stopped. Maybe some tiny flicker of humanity broke through his depravity for just a second. Maybe he just wasn't ready to kill her yet. Maybe he still wanted to use her. Whatever the reason, he loosened the rope and let her breathe. Shasta survived that night, but the terror of that moment would stay with her forever. Not long after that, Duncan asked Shasta if she wanted to meet his mother. She said yes, probably because she would have said yes to anything if it meant getting out of those woods, if it meant a chance at escape, if it meant being around other people who might help her. And so Duncan packed up the campsite, put Shasta in his Jeep Cherokee, and started driving back toward civilization. On the evening of July 1, 2005, security cameras at a convenience store in Kellogg, Idaho, about 40 miles east of Coeur d'Alene, captured footage of Duncan and Shasta entering the store. An employee later recognized Shasta from missing person posters but didn't confront them at the time, as nothing appeared immediately out of the ordinary. By the time the employee realized who the girl might have been and reviewed the footage, Duncan and Shasta had already left. Duncan never made it to his mother's house. Instead, in the early morning hours of July 2, 2005, around 2 a.m., he pulled into the Denny's restaurant on Appleway Avenue in Coeur d'Alene, and that's where his reign of terror finally came to an end. The Denny's restaurant on Appleway Avenue in Coeur d'Alene wasn't known for anything particularly special. It was just another 24-hour diner, the kind of place where truckers grab coffee and insomniacs order breakfast at odd hours. But on the morning of July 2, 2005, it became the site of a miracle. When Duncan walked in with Shasta just after 2 a.m., they looked like a father and daughter stopping for a late-night meal. Duncan was calm, almost cheerful. Shasta was quiet, withdrawn, but not visibly distressed in a way that would immediately raise alarm to someone who didn't know her story. They sat down in a booth near the window, and Duncan ordered food. But Amber Dean, the waitress on duty, took a second look at the little girl. Something about her face was familiar. For weeks, this entire community had been plastered with missing person posters. Shasta's face was everywhere, on telephone poles, in shop windows, on the news every single night. And as Amber stared at this child sitting across from this man, recognition hit her like a freight train. "That's Shasta Groene." She didn't panic. She didn't gasp or run over to the table or do anything that might spook the man. Instead, she caught the eye of her manager, Linda Olson, and tilted her head toward the booth. The manager looked. She saw it too. That was Shasta Groene. And if that was Shasta, then the man sitting across from her was likely responsible for one of the most horrific crimes in Idaho history. Linda called 911 while Amber engaged Duncan and Shasta in conversation. She offered to make Shasta a milkshake, then deliberately stalled in preparing it. Buying time for police to arrive. Other employees positioned themselves near exits. Other customers in the restaurant, regulars who had also seen the news coverage, started to realize what was happening. Everyone held their breath. Everyone waited. When police officers arrived, they entered the restaurant with their weapons drawn but their demeanor controlled. They didn't want to create a hostage situation. They didn't want to give Duncan any reason to hurt Shasta. They approached the booth and ordered Duncan to stand up and put his hands where they could see them. And Joseph Edward Duncan III, a man who had evaded capture for decades, who had murdered at least 7 people, including 3 children, did something that shocked everyone. He complied. He didn't fight. He didn't resist. He didn't threaten Shasta or try to use her as a shield. He stood up, put his hands out, and let the officers handcuff him without incident. When Amber asked Shasta where her brother was, the little girl's response broke everyone's heart. "My brother is in heaven." Shasta identified herself to the waitress and the police officers. She said her name clearly. "I'm Shasta Groene." She was taken to Kootenai Medical Center for medical treatment and evaluation. She was malnourished, traumatized, showing signs of prolonged SA, but she was alive. Hours later, she was reunited with her father, Steve Groene, who had spent 47 days living in a hell of not knowing, of searching, of hopping against hope. The image of him hugging his daughter, both of them crying, made headlines around the world. For their quick thinking and heroic actions, Linda Olson and Amber Dean were each awarded checks of $4,315 from a reward fund donated by local businesses and residents. But no amount of money could capture the significance of what they had done. They had saved a little girl's life. They had brought a killer to justice. They had given a community some measure of closure, even though the news about Dylan would soon shatter hearts all over again. But there was still one question everyone was asking: where is Dylan? When police interrogated Duncan after his arrest, when they searched his Jeep Cherokee and found the evidence of what he had done, camping gear, ropes, a shotgun, zip ties, and digital storage devices containing photographs and videos that made hardened detectives physically ill, they pressed him for information about Dylan. "Where is the boy? What did you do with him? Is he still alive?" Duncan eventually told them, though based on what investigators could determine from Shasta's statements, he likely knew Dylan had no chance of being found alive. He drew investigators a map. He directed them to that remote campsite in the Lolo National Forest near St. Regis, Montana, in a rugged area where few people ventured. On July 4, 2005, just 2 days after Shasta's rescue, search teams found human remains at the site Duncan had described. The remains were in an advanced state of decomposition, buried in a shallow grave at the remote makeshift campsite. They were sent to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia for DNA testing. The results confirmed what everyone already feared. The remains belonged to 9-year-old Dylan Groene. Steve Groene, Dylan and Shasta's father, had told reporters that until someone confirmed the remains were Dylan's, he would hold on to hope that his son was still alive. But on July 10, 2005, when the FBI made the positive identification, that hope died. Dylan was gone. He had been murdered in that wilderness, alone except for his terrified sister, killed by a monster who had taken everything from this family. Joseph Duncan was charged with kidnapping and murder. He was held without bond. And as investigators started digging into his background, as they started connecting the dots and running his fingerprints through databases, a terrifying picture emerged. The Groene family wasn't his first. They weren't even close. Joseph Edward Duncan III was born on February 25, 1963, in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, though some sources indicate he was actually born in Tacoma, Washington. He was one of 5 children born to Joseph Edward Duncan Jr. and Lillian Mee Duncan. His father served in the United States Army, which meant the family moved constantly, city to city, base to base, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. Eventually, the family settled in Tacoma, Washington. In later interviews, court documents, and on his blog, Duncan would claim he was SA'd as a child, that he had been physically abused, that trauma had shaped him into the monster he became. He painted a picture of a horrific childhood that broke something fundamental inside him. But his younger brother later disputed these claims in interviews with the media, saying that while their mother was strict and their home life wasn't perfect, there was no abuse to the extent Joseph described. Their parents divorced when Duncan was young, and his father remarried. 3 of his older sisters moved out at once, which may have contributed to instability in the home. Whether Duncan was telling the truth or creating a narrative to justify his crimes remains unclear. What is clear, what is documented beyond any dispute, is that by the time he was an adolescent, something was very, very wrong with Joseph Duncan. His first recorded sex crime occurred in 1978 in Tacoma when he was just 15 years old. He raped a 9-year-old boy at gunpoint. Let that sink in. At 15, an age when most teenagers are worried about high school and acne and first dates, Joseph Duncan was committing violent crimes against children. He wasn't experimenting or confused. He was a predator. The following year, in 1979, he was arrested for stealing a car. Instead of being sent to a juvenile detention facility or receiving serious consequences, he was sentenced to the Jesse Dislin Boys Ranch in Tacoma, Washington, a reform program meant to rehabilitate troubled youth. At the Boys Ranch, Duncan was assigned a therapist as part of his treatment, and in what should have been a massive red flag, a warning sign that could have prevented decades of future horror, Duncan confessed to his therapist that he had bound and essayed 6 younger boys. He also told the therapist that by the age of 16, he estimated he had raped 13 younger boys. 13. He was still a teenager himself, and he had already left a trail of traumatized victims. The therapist documented these confessions. The evaluation was written down, placed in his file, but nothing happened. Duncan wasn't prosecuted for those crimes. He wasn't locked away. He wasn't treated as the dangerous predator he clearly was. He was released back into society after just a few months, a predator who had openly admitted to serial SA of children, free to continue hunting. In 1980, when Duncan was 16 or 17 years old, he stole several guns from a neighbor's house in Tacoma. He then used one of those guns to kidnap and rape a 14-year-old boy at gunpoint. This time, the justice system took action. Duncan was arrested, charged, and convicted. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Initially, the judge suspended the sentence so that Duncan could receive sex offender treatment at Western State Hospital. Doctors evaluating him said the danger he presents to children is very great, and he is not safe to be at large. After 22 months in the treatment program, doctors reported that Mr. Duncan has shown an unwillingness to modify his sexually deviant behaviors, and that treatment wasn't working. The suspended sentence was revoked in 1982, and Duncan was sent to prison to serve his full term. He was clinically diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder while incarcerated. He told authorities that his first SA occurred when he was just 12 years old, when he assaulted a 5-year-old boy. By his own admission, he had been a predator since childhood. In 1994, after serving 14 years of his 20-year sentence, Joseph Duncan was released on parole. He was 31 years old. He had spent most of his adolescence and all of his 20s in prison. He had received treatment, therapy, counseling. He had been deemed rehabilitated enough to be released back into society. The terms of his parole required that he have no contact with minor children and that he register as a sex offender wherever he lived. Duncan moved to the Seattle area, and the moment he got out, he started hunting again. In 1996, he was arrested for marijuana use and released on parole several weeks later with new restrictions. But those restrictions didn't stop him. Authorities now believe that during his parole period between 1994 and 1997, Duncan murdered at least 3 children, though both cases went cold and were not tied to him until years later. In 1997, Duncan violated the terms of his parole and was arrested in Kansas. He was returned to prison, but in July 2000, after serving additional time, he was released again with credit for good behavior. He moved to Fargo, North Dakota, registered as a sex offender as required, and tried to blend into normal society. His neighbors had no idea who was living among them. He was just another guy, quiet, kept to himself. No one knew that a predator was in their midst. On the night of July 6, 1996, While Joseph Duncan was on parole and living in the Seattle area, two young girls were staying with their mother and siblings at the Crest Motel on Aurora Avenue North in Seattle. The motel was one of those cheap, run-down places where families living paycheck to paycheck would stay when they didn't have anywhere else to go. Room 16 was home to 9-year-old Carmen Cubias and her 11-year-old half-sister Samieo White, along with their mother and other siblings. That night, shortly before 11 p.m. on a Saturday, Carmen and Samieo told their mom they were going to walk to a nearby Taco Time restaurant to get food, or according to some reports, to panhandle or beg for food from customers at the restaurant. It was a short walk, nothing unusual for the area, just two sisters going out together. Their mother said, "Okay, be careful, be back soon." The girls left the motel room. They never came back. Their mother waited. She called their names. She walked the route to the restaurant and back, her worry escalating into panic with every passing minute. She called the police. An investigation was launched, but there were no witnesses, no leads, no surveillance footage that captured what happened. Carmen and Samieo had simply vanished from a busy urban area. For months, their mother held on to hope. She put up missing person posters all over Seattle. She talked to the media. She begged anyone with information to come forward. Investigators followed thousands of leads, interviewed hundreds of people, but nothing panned out. As weeks turned into months, hope began to fade. And then, on February 10, 1998, nearly a year and a half after the girls disappeared, their skeletal remains were found in an abandoned barn in Bothell, Washington, just outside Seattle. The condition of the remains made it difficult to determine a precise cause of death, but investigators could tell the girls had been murdered. Based on the condition of the bodies and the evidence at the scene, most investigators agree they had been beaten to death. The case went cold. There were no suspects, no physical evidence tying anyone to the crime, no witnesses who saw the girls leave with anyone. Carmen and Samieo became two more tragic statistics, two more unsolved murders in a system overwhelmed with cases. Their family was left without justice, without answers, without closure. But years later, in July 2005, during interviews with FBI agents after his arrest in the Groene case, Joseph Duncan would confess. He admitted that he had lured Carmen and Samieo away from that motel. He admitted that he had taken them somewhere isolated, that he had done unspeakable things to them, that he had beaten them to death and hidden their bodies in that barn, leaving them there like garbage. He had gotten away with it for almost a decade, and that emboldened him to keep going. In early 1997, Joseph Duncan was still on parole from his 1980 conviction, supposedly living in the Seattle area under supervision. But at some point between late 1996 and early 1997, he left Washington and traveled south to California. Maybe he was looking for new hunting grounds. Maybe he was running from something. Whatever the reason, he ended up in Beaumont, a small city in Riverside County, in the inland region east of Los Angeles. On April 4, 1997, a beautiful spring Friday afternoon that should have been filled with the sounds of children playing and birds singing, 10-year-old Anthony Michael Martinez was in the front yard of a neighbor's house with his younger brother and some friends. They were doing what kids do, laughing, running around, enjoying the sunshine, playing together in the safety of their neighborhood. A man approached the group of boys. He looked non-threatening, just a regular guy, and he had a story. According to what the boys told police, the man said he was looking for his lost cat and offered them $1 if they would help him find it. The boys, who had been taught about stranger danger, refused. They said no, they hadn't seen any cat, they weren't going to help. The man persisted, and when the boys continued to refuse, his demeanor changed completely. Suddenly, he lunged forward and grabbed Anthony's younger brother. He had a knife. He held it near the boy's throat, trying to force him into a vehicle. But the younger brother fought back, struggling and kicking. And then Anthony did something incredibly brave. He intervened. He threw himself at the man, fighting him, pulling his brother away, sacrificing himself to save his sibling. The man released the younger brother and grabbed Anthony instead. He held the knife to Anthony's head and throat, telling the other children not to move, not to scream, or he would hurt Anthony. The other boys, including Anthony's younger brother, stood frozen in terror as this stranger dragged Anthony toward a white vehicle parked nearby and threw him inside. Anthony fought back with everything he had. He struggled and kicked and screamed, not to save himself, but to make sure the man couldn't take anyone else, to make sure his little brother was safe. The other boys ran for help, screaming for adults, but by the time neighbors arrived, the vehicle was gone. Anthony was gone. A massive search effort was launched immediately. Law enforcement agencies across Southern California were mobilized. Volunteers combed the area. Anthony's family went on the news, begging for his safe return, begging the kidnapper to let their boy come home. For 2 weeks, they held on to hope. For 2 weeks, they prayed for a miracle. On April 19, 1997, 15 days after Anthony was taken, a forest ranger discovered a body in Burdu Canyon in the Indio Hills, a remote desert area near Indio, California, about 70 miles east of Beaumont. The body was nude and partially decomposed, lying in the harsh wilderness. It was bound with duct tape. The body was Anthony Martinez. The medical examiner determined that Anthony had been essayed before being murdered. Investigators collected evidence from the scene, including a partial fingerprint from the duct tape that had been used to bind Anthony's hands. They created a composite sketch of the suspect based on descriptions from the boys who had witnessed the abduction. The sketch showed a man with a mustache and distinctive features. The case became huge news in Southern California. The community of Beaumont united in grief, tying yellow ribbons to trees, holding vigils, vowing that Anthony would not be forgotten. Authorities followed up on over 15,000 leads over the next 8 years. Before the end of April 1997, investigators had evaluated more than 100 people as potential suspects, but none of them panned out. The partial fingerprint didn't match anyone in the database at that time. The composite sketch didn't lead to any arrests. Anthony Martinez's murder became another unsolved case, another family left without justice, without answers, without closure. His younger brother, the boy Anthony had saved, would have to live with the knowledge that his brother had died protecting him. But that fingerprint sat in evidence, waiting. In July 2005, after Joseph Duncan's arrest in Idaho, something remarkable happened. Bloggers and online sleuths following the Groene case started noticing something. They looked at the composite sketch from the Anthony Martinez case and compared it to photographs of Joseph Duncan. They noted similarities. They also noted that Duncan's vehicle looked similar to the one described in the Martinez abduction. They started posting about it online, connecting the dots. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children took notice. They contacted Riverside County authorities and suggested they run Joseph Duncan's fingerprints against the evidence from the Anthony Martinez case. On August 3, 2005, Riverside County Sheriff Bob Doyle held a press conference. He announced that investigators had positively matched Joseph Duncan's fingerprint to the partial print recovered from the duct tape used to bind Anthony Martinez. After 8 years and 15,000 leads, they finally had their suspect. During an interview with FBI agents on July 19, 2005, Duncan confessed to killing Anthony, but he didn't express remorse. Instead, he described it as revenge against society for sending him back to jail on a probation violation, as if murdering a child could somehow be justified as retaliation against a system, as if a 10-year-old boy's life was worth less than Duncan's freedom, as if Anthony's heroism in saving his brother meant nothing. Anthony's family finally had answers, but those answers brought no comfort. Their son, their brother, their little boy had suffered at the hands of a monster, and that monster had been free to kill again and again because the system had failed to stop him. One of the most disturbing aspects of Joseph Duncan's story is that he documented his own depravity in real time, posting his thoughts and confessions on the internet for anyone to read. Before his arrest for the Groene murders, Duncan maintained a personal blog called The Fifth Nail. The name came from a piece of lore. Supposedly, according to the legend, in addition to the 4 nails used to crucify Jesus Christ on the cross, there was a 5th nail that was taken away and hidden by the Roma people, also known as gypsies. Duncan adopted this name for his website and blog, positioning himself as someone who carried a secret, a hidden truth that the world wasn't ready to see. On his blog, which he published openly on the internet, Duncan wrote extensively about his life as a registered sex offender. He complained about what he called state-sanctioned discrimination against sex offenders. He was particularly angry about the requirement for sex offenders to participate in a public registry, arguing that it persecuted people like him and prevented them from reintegrating into society. He positioned himself as an advocate for sex offender rights, as if he were fighting for some noble cause rather than trying to justify his access to potential victims. But mixed in with his advocacy and his complaints were far more disturbing entries. Duncan wrote about his struggles with what he called his demons, his fantasies and compulsions, his urges to harm children. He described violent SA fantasies in detail. He denied being a pedophile despite his extensive history of crimes against children, claiming instead that his attractions were more complex, more nuanced than simple labels could capture. He also wrote about his past, claiming he had been SA'd as a child, that trauma had broken something inside him, that he was a victim too. It was a carefully crafted narrative designed to garner sympathy, to make him seem like a tortured soul battling inner demons rather than a predator who chose to hurt children. Criminologists and psychiatric researchers studied the blog, trying to better understand the mind and behaviors of a violent offender. But what they found wasn't a window into mental illness or uncontrollable compulsion. What they found was a man who understood exactly what he was doing, who planned his crimes meticulously, who enjoyed the attention and notoriety. In July 2004, Duncan was arrested for molesting 2 young boys, ages 6 and 7, at a playground in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. The incident occurred on July 3, 2004. He appeared before a Becker County judge in March 2005, and on April 5, 2005, bail was set at $15,000. A businessman from Fargo, North Dakota named Joe Crary, someone Duncan had befriended, posted his bail. Duncan was released with the understanding that he would appear for trial and comply with all restrictions. He never showed up. On April 5, 2005, the same day he was released on bail, Duncan skipped town. On June 1, 2005, a federal warrant was issued for his arrest for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. But Duncan was already gone, already planning his next crime. In the weeks before the Groene family murders, Duncan posted disturbing entries on his blog. He wrote about his demons winning, about giving in to his darkest impulses, about losing the battle to control his violent urges. In entries that can still be found archived online, he wrote chilling statements about his intentions. Most disturbing was an entry where Duncan described his plan to go out in a blaze of glory. He wrote about his intention to kidnap, rape, and murder as many children as he could before getting caught. He wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't using metaphors or vague language. He was announcing his intentions to the world, and no one stopped him. Investigators later determined that Duncan had been researching the Groene family online, that he had been planning the attack for weeks, that he had surveilled their home and learned their routines. And during all of that, he continued blogging, continued documenting his descent into violence. After his arrest and during his imprisonment, Duncan continued blogging through a proxy. Someone on the outside, using the pseudonym Silenced or Ghost Blogger, would post letters and writings from Duncan on a blogspot site. The blog was titled Fifth Nail Revelations, or Joseph E. Duncan III returns to the web from federal death row. In these posts, Duncan continued to paint himself as a victim, to philosophize about evil and justice and the nature of his crimes. He wrote about life on death row, claiming he rarely interacted with other prisoners by choice, that he actively chose not to socialize with anyone. He wrote that he occasionally faced harassment from correctional officers but never received trouble from other inmates. He wrote his blog entries by hand and mailed them to his proxy, who posted them exactly as written. According to media reports, law enforcement agencies monitored the contents of the blog in hopes of gathering incriminating information about Duncan's crimes, both known and unknown. People familiar with Duncan's handwriting confirmed the entries were authentic. The fact that he could maintain a blog from death row, that he could continue to have a public platform, infuriated the families of his victims. Here was a man who had destroyed so many lives, and he was still finding ways to insert himself into the narrative, to control the story, to make it about him. He continued to seek attention, continued to position himself as someone misunderstood rather than as the monster he truly was. After his arrest, Joseph Duncan faced multiple trials in multiple jurisdictions. The legal process was long, complicated, and emotionally exhausting for everyone involved, particularly for Shasta Groene, who had to relive her trauma so that justice could be served. Duncan made his first court appearance in Kootenai County, Idaho on July 6, 2005, during his arraignment on 2 counts of first-degree kidnapping. On July 13, 2005, he was formally charged in Idaho State Court with 3 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Brenda Groene, Slade Groene, and Mark McKenzie, as well as 3 counts of first-degree kidnapping. Kootenai County prosecutors initially planned to charge Duncan with the kidnappings of Shasta and Dylan as well, but they deferred those charges to the federal court system. Under United States federal law, transporting children across state lines for the purpose of SA and exploitation is a federal offense, which meant federal prosecutors could pursue the death penalty under federal statutes. Trial was initially set to begin on January 17, 2006, but was delayed multiple times. Defense attorneys requested more time to prepare, and the judge granted extensions, first to April 4, 2006, and then again to October 26, 2006. The judge stated that no one wants to try this case twice, including me, explaining the need for thorough preparation given the complexity and severity of the charges. Then, on October 16, 2006, shortly after jury selection began for his state trial, something unexpected happened. Duncan's attorneys reached a plea deal with Kootenai County prosecutors. Duncan pleaded guilty to all state charges against him, 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of first-degree kidnapping. He was immediately sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole for the kidnapping charges. However, sentencing on the 3 murder charges was postponed pending the outcome of his federal trial. The judge stated that if Duncan did not receive the death penalty on federal charges, he would return to Kootenai County for a death penalty phase on the state murder charges. The federal case was a different matter entirely. On January 18, 2007, a federal grand jury in Coeur d'Alene indicted Duncan on 10 counts. The charges included kidnapping resulting in death, aggravated SA of a minor, sexual exploitation of a child resulting in death, and other offenses related to illegal firearm possession and vehicle theft. He was arraigned the following day at a federal court in Boise, Idaho, and a trial date was initially set for March 2007, then postponed to January 22, 2008. On December 3, 2007, before the trial began, Duncan pleaded guilty to all 10 federal charges against him. As part of the plea agreement, Shasta Groene would not have to testify during the penalty phase of the trial. This was crucial. Shasta, who was still just a child, had already been through unimaginable trauma. Prosecutors wanted to spare her from having to relive those horrors on the witness stand, while Duncan sat there watching her. Due to a gag order imposed by the court, other details of the plea agreement were not released to the public. The penalty phase of Duncan's federal trial began on August 13, 2008. The purpose of this phase was to determine whether Joseph Duncan would receive the death penalty or life in prison. Jury selection was a process in itself, requiring the court to find 12 people who could hear the horrific evidence and make a decision about whether this man should live or die. And then, in a move that shocked everyone, Duncan dismissed his attorneys and chose to represent himself. His lawyers objected strenuously, arguing he was incompetent to do so. The court ordered a psychological evaluation, and the evaluator concluded that Duncan was competent to proceed without counsel. So Joseph Duncan, a man with no legal training but plenty of experience manipulating systems, represented himself in a death penalty trial. The evidence presented to the jury was beyond horrific. They had to watch videos of Duncan torturing Dylan Groene. They saw images of Shasta in captivity, her face haunted and terrified. They heard testimony from investigators who had found the campsites, who had recovered Dylan's remains, who had interviewed Shasta in the immediate aftermath of her rescue. One video shown in court was 33 minutes long and depicted Duncan tormenting Dylan while the boy cried and begged him to stop. In the video, Duncan could be heard saying those chilling words, "The devil is here, boy, the devil himself." The devil likes to watch children suffer and cry. Jurors had to watch this. They had to bear witness to the suffering of an innocent child at the hands of a monster who was sitting right there in the courtroom. Jurors left the courtroom in tears. Some became physically ill. The judge, recognizing the psychological toll of the evidence, allowed jurors access to mental health services to help them process what they had been forced to witness. Several jurors would later say the case haunted them, that they still had nightmares about what they had seen. On August 27, 2008, after 3 hours of deliberation, the jury recommended the death penalty. They found that the aggravating factors in the case, the brutality of the crimes, the torture of children, the lack of any mitigating circumstances, warranted the ultimate punishment. The judge imposed 3 death sentences, one for kidnapping resulting in death, one for criminal exploitation of a child resulting in death, and one for use of a firearm in a violent crime resulting in death, all related to Dylan Groene's murder. On November 3, 2008, Duncan was sentenced to 3 additional consecutive terms of life without parole for kidnapping Shasta and for the crimes he committed against both children. But the trials weren't over. California wanted their turn. On January 18, 2007, the same day Duncan was federally indicted in Idaho, Riverside County officials announced they were charging him with the murder of Anthony Martinez. California has its own death penalty, and prosecutors wanted to make sure Duncan faced justice for Anthony's death in the state where the crime occurred. There were legal battles about extradition, with federal authorities wanting to complete their trial first. Eventually, on January 24, 2009, 5 months after being sentenced to death by the federal court, Duncan was extradited to California to face charges in Riverside County. On March 15, 2011, Duncan pleaded guilty to Anthony Martinez's murder. He was sentenced to 2 additional life terms without the possibility of parole on April 5, 2011. As part of the plea deal, the sentence came without the right to appeal. The judge ordered Duncan to pay $7,000 to Anthony's family to cover the cost of the child's funeral. Riverside County District Attorney Paul Zellerbach explained the decision to accept a plea deal rather than pursue another death penalty trial. He stated that he had consulted extensively with the Martinez family, who wanted closure after 14 years of waiting for justice. Zellerbach noted that the federal system will kill him long before the state of California would have seriously considered it, given the lengthy appeals process in California death penalty cases. In a statement after sentencing, Judge Michael Donner said, "I can say in my 31 years being involved in the criminal justice system, I've never met a more evil person than Joseph Duncan." Anthony's mother told reporters that Duncan showed no remorse whatsoever, that it would be ridiculous to even attempt to think that in any way, shape, or form that he had any type of remorse. Joseph Edward Duncan III had been convicted in 3 different courts. He had received 3 death sentences and 11 consecutive life sentences. He had confessed to a total of 7 murders spanning nearly a decade. Carmen Cubias and Samuel White in Washington in 1996, Anthony Martinez in California in 1997, and Brenda Groene, Mark McKenzie, Slade Groene, and Dylan Groene in Idaho in 2005. He would never see freedom again. He was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, to await execution on federal death row. When we talk about cases like this, it's easy to focus on the killer, to get lost in the psychology and the timeline and the horrific details of the crimes. But we have to remember that at the center of this story are real people whose lives were stolen, families who were shattered, communities that were traumatized. Brenda Groene was 40 years old when she died. She was a mother who loved her children fiercely. She worked hard, she struggled to make ends meet, but she did everything she could to provide for Slade, Dylan, and Shasta. She had found happiness with Mark McKenzie, and she was trying to build a stable, loving home for her family. She died trying to protect her Bobbies, bound and helpless, unable to stop the monster who invaded her home. Mark McKenzie was 37 years old. He wasn't the children's biological father, but he cared about them. He showed up. He tried to be a positive presence in their lives. He became a part of their family. He died alongside them, bound and helpless, unable to save the people he loved. Slade Groene was just 13 years old. He was at that age where boys start becoming men, where they think about their futures and their dreams. He was protective of his younger siblings. According to Shasta's account, he tried to escape, tried to get help, tried to fight back even though he was injured and terrified. He died a hero, but he never should have had to be one. Dylan Groene was 9 years old when he was kidnapped, and he died before he could turn 10. He loved video games and playing outside and being a kid. He endured weeks of torture and SA in that Montana wilderness before Joseph Duncan shot him in the head and buried him in a shallow grave. His memorial service was held on what would have been his 10th birthday, July 16, 2005. His family had to bury an empty casket because Dylan's remains were still being held as evidence. Carmen Cubias was 9 years old and Samuel White was 11 when they disappeared from that motel in Seattle on the night of July 6, 1996. They were sisters, and they were just going to get food. They should have come home that night. Instead, their lives were stolen and their bodies weren't found for almost 2 years. Their family waited and hoped and prayed, and when the truth finally came, it was more horrific than they could have imagined. Anthony Martinez was 10 years old when he sacrificed himself to save his little brother on April 4, 1997. He fought back against Joseph Duncan, even though he knew it meant he would be taken. He put his brother's life before his own. He died a hero, but he never should have had to be one. His family waited 15 days, hoping for his safe return, before a forest ranger found his body in the desert. And then there's Shasta Groene, the survivor, the little girl who endured 7 weeks of hell and came out the other side. The girl who watched her family die, who was tortured and SA'd, who witnessed her brother's murder, who was nearly killed herself, and who still found the strength to survive. After her rescue, Shasta faced a long, difficult road of healing. She had to process the trauma of what happened to her, the loss of her mother and brothers, the things she witnessed and experienced. She had to testify, had to recount her ordeal so that Duncan could be convicted, had to see his face again in courtroom after courtroom. In the years following her rescue, Shasta struggled. She fell into drug use as a teenager, using substances to numb the pain and escape the memories that haunted her. She has been open about her battles with depression, PTSD, and bipolar disorder. At age 14, she started using methamphetamine, and for 4 years, she struggled with addiction. When she was 17, a judge sent her to the St. Anthony Juvenile Correctional Center in eastern Idaho. That's where, Shasta says, her path to healing truly began. After over a year there, she became clean and sober. She moved to a step-down program in the Treasure Valley area of Idaho, where she worked on her sobriety and got back on her feet. But Shasta has shown incredible strength and resilience. She has refused to let Joseph Duncan define her. In 2016, when she was 19 years old, she started a petition called Slade and Dylan's Law in honor of her murdered brothers. The petition called for convicted violent offenders to never be released from prison, effectively reducing the three-strike rule for violent offenses to one strike. The petition gathered over 51,000 signatures. Shasta has spoken publicly about her experience, about the failures of the justice system that allowed Joseph Duncan to keep offending, about the need for change so that other families don't have to suffer what hers did. She has become an advocate, using her voice to push for stronger protections for children and harsher penalties for those who harm them. She has taken her pain and turned it into purpose. She has refused to be just a victim. She is more than that. She is a survivor, a warrior, a voice for the voiceless. She has built a life for herself, has had children of her own, has found moments of joy and peace despite the horrors of her past. When asked about Joseph Duncan, Shasta has said that she doesn't think about him anymore, that she doesn't give him power over her life. She has found a way to move forward, to heal, to live. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is the ultimate defeat of the monster who tried to destroy her. Joseph Duncan's crimes raise uncomfortable questions that society still hasn't fully answered. How did this man offend for decades despite multiple arrests, despite confessions, despite being a registered sex offender? Why was he released on parole in 1994 after serving time for kidnapping and raping a child at gunpoint? Why was he given bail in 2005 when he was facing charges for molesting 2 boys on a playground? Why didn't anyone take action when he was openly blogging about his violent fantasies on a public website? The system failed. Over and over again, at every possible juncture, the system failed to stop Joseph Duncan. He confessed to his therapist at age 16 that he had assaulted 13 boys. That confession was documented in official records. Mental health professionals stated he was too dangerous to be at large. And yet, nothing happened. He wasn't prosecuted for those crimes. He was released after a few months at the boys' ranch. He was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in 1980 for kidnapping and raping a 14-year-old boy at gunpoint. After 22 months in a treatment program, doctors reported that he had shown an unwillingness to modify his sexually deviant behaviors, and that treatment wasn't working. He served 14 years and was released on parole in 1994. He violated that parole and was returned to prison in 1997. And then he was released again in 2000. In July 2004, he was arrested for molesting 2 young boys at a playground in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. In March 2005, he appeared before a judge, and bail was set at $15,000. A businessman who barely knew him posted that bail. Duncan walked out of that courtroom a free man, despite his extensive history, despite being a registered sex offender, despite having just been accused of molesting children again. If that judge had denied bail, if that businessman hadn't posted it, if Duncan had been held in custody while awaiting trial, the grown family would still be alive. Brenda would be 61 years old now. Slade would be 32. Dylan would be 28. They would have lived their lives, celebrated birthdays and graduations and weddings, grown old with their loved ones. If Duncan had been prosecuted for the crimes he confessed to as a teenager, Carmen and Samuel and Anthony might still be alive. If his parole had been revoked earlier and he'd been kept in prison, if he'd been monitored more closely after his 2000 release, If someone had read his blog and taken his threats seriously enough to alert authorities, lives could have been saved. But they weren't, because the system is broken, because judges and parole boards and prosecutors make decisions based on overcrowded prisons and limited resources and legal precedent and the belief that people can be rehabilitated. And sometimes they're right, but sometimes they're catastrophically wrong. Joseph Duncan told people what he was. He showed them through his actions. Mental health professionals evaluated him and said he was dangerous. He had a documented history spanning decades. He wrote about his intentions on a public blog. And still, he kept being released. Still, he kept being given chances. Still, he kept being allowed to walk free among potential victims. The question that haunts us isn't just, how could someone do this? It's, how many times did we have the chance to stop him, and why didn't we? After his convictions, Joseph Duncan was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, to await execution on federal death row. The facility houses male inmates awaiting execution under federal death sentences. Duncan would spend the rest of his life in a small cell, isolated from the general prison population, waiting for a death that would ultimately come from a different source than anyone expected. Through his blog, which continued to be updated via his proxy, Duncan wrote about life on death row. He said he rarely interacted with other prisoners, and that he actively chose not to speak with them, that he didn't socialize with anyone. He claimed he never received trouble from other inmates, but occasionally faced harassment from correctional officers, though the veracity of these claims is unclear given his documented history of manipulation and lying. He wrote about his daily routine, his thoughts, his continued attempts to justify his actions. He philosophized about evil and justice and the nature of his crimes, positioning himself as someone misunderstood rather than as the monster he was. He continued to seek attention and control the narrative even from behind bars. In 2019, when the federal government announced it would resume executions after a nearly two-decade hiatus, Duncan wrote that he was relieved. He said being executed by lethal injection would be a better and cleaner way to die than dying of natural causes in prison. He wrote that he feared growing old and sick behind bars more than he feared death itself. He wanted the execution to happen, wanted it to be over. But fate had other plans. In October 2020, Joseph Duncan was diagnosed with glioblastoma, an aggressive and deadly form of stage 4 brain cancer. It's the same type of cancer that killed Senator John McCain and Beau Biden. It's almost always fatal. Duncan underwent brain surgery in an attempt to remove the tumor, but the prognosis was grim. Medical staff estimated he had between 6 and 12 months to live. Duncan declined chemotherapy and radiation therapy. He chose to let the cancer run its course. Maybe he thought it was poetic justice. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he just wanted it to be over. Whatever his reasons, he made his choice. On March 28, 2021, at approximately 1 a.m., Joseph Edward Duncan III died in federal custody at a hospital near the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. He was 58 years old. The cause of death was glioblastoma. He had been on federal death row for nearly 13 years, waiting for an execution that never came. The families of his victims had mixed reactions to the news. Some felt robbed of the closure that an execution might have brought. They wanted to see him face the ultimate punishment for what he had done. They wanted him to know the exact day and time he was going to die, to feel that terror, that helplessness, the same way his victims had. Others felt relief that he was gone, that he could never hurt anyone else, that he couldn't continue to traumatize them through appeals and interviews and blog posts. Shasta Groene, who was 24 years old at the time of Duncan's death, released a statement through social media. She said she had spent years processing her trauma, working toward healing, and that his death was just another part of that journey. She wrote that she refused to give him power over her life anymore. She said that, while she understood some people wanted him to suffer more, she was just glad he was gone. She could finally close that chapter of her life. Steve Groene, Shasta's father and Dylan's father, told reporters that the evil that was Joseph Duncan is no more. He said that while Duncan's death didn't bring his son back, didn't erase the pain, it did mean that this monster could never hurt another child. Anthony Martinez's family released a statement saying they were glad Duncan was dead, but that it didn't erase 24 years of pain and loss. Nothing could bring Anthony back. Nothing could give them back the life their son should have lived. Duncan's body was cremated. There was no public memorial service. There was no outpouring of sympathy. No obituary in the newspaper celebrating his life. He died as he lived, alone, despised, a cautionary tale about the nature of evil and the failures of a system that let him keep offending for decades. His blog went silent. The proxy who had been posting his writings stopped updating. The fifth nail, that monument to Duncan's narcissism and depravity, faded into the archives of the internet. A digital tombstone for a man who wanted so desperately to be remembered, to be understood, to be seen as something other than what he was. But history will not be kind to Joseph Edward Duncan III. He will not be remembered as a victim of circumstance or a tortured soul. He will be remembered for what he was, a monster who chose to hurt children, who chose to kill, who chose to inflict unimaginable suffering on innocent people and their families. So who was Joseph Edward Duncan really? Was he a product of his environment, shaped by abuse and neglect into a monster? Or was he born with something fundamentally broken inside him, something that no amount of therapy or punishment could fix? Psychiatrists who evaluated Duncan over the years diagnosed him with pedophilia, criminal sadism disorder, and antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic traits. They agreed he was legally sane, meaning he understood the difference between right and wrong and knew his actions were criminal. He wasn't insane in the legal sense. He wasn't hearing voices or experiencing delusions that made him unable to distinguish reality. He knew exactly what he was doing. He planned his crimes. He took precautions to avoid getting caught. He was organized, methodical, calculating. The diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder means Duncan lacked empathy, lacked remorse, lacked the ability to form genuine emotional connections with other people. The narcissistic traits meant he believed he was special, that rules didn't apply to him, that his needs and desires were more important than anyone else's. The criminal sadism meant he derived pleasure from inflicting pain and suffering on others. Duncan himself went back and forth on this throughout his life. Sometimes he claimed he was a victim, that his childhood trauma made him what he was, that he couldn't control his urges. He would write long blog posts about his demons, about the voices in his head telling him to do terrible things, about how he tried to fight them but they were too strong. Other times he seemed to relish in his crimes, to take pride in the fear he caused, to enjoy the attention and notoriety his case brought him. In his writings, he often referred to his demons as if his violent impulses were separate entities that possessed him. He gave them names. He described them as forces outside his control. But this was just another justification, another way to avoid taking responsibility. Duncan knew exactly what he was doing. He planned his crimes meticulously. He chose vulnerable victims. He took steps to avoid getting caught. He wasn't possessed by demons. He was the demon. The truth is, we may never fully understand what made Joseph Duncan the way he was. We can point to risk factors and warning signs and failures of the system. We can analyze his psychology and his history. We can read his writings and study his behaviors. But at the end of the day, he made choices. He chose to hurt children. He chose to kill. He chose to inflict unimaginable suffering on innocent people. And those choices have consequences that ripple outward, touching the lives of victims' families, communities, and everyone who hears this story. Some people are just evil. That's a hard truth to accept in a world that wants to believe everyone can be saved, everyone can be rehabilitated, everyone deserves a second chance. But Joseph Duncan had dozens of chances. He was evaluated by mental health professionals who said he was too dangerous to be free. He was convicted multiple times. He confessed to crimes he was never prosecuted for. He served time, got treatment, was released. And every single time, he went back to hunting children. At some point, we have to accept that some people cannot be fixed. Some people will always be a danger to society. Some people choose evil over and over again, despite every opportunity to choose differently. If there's any meaning to be found in this horror, it's in the lessons we must learn to prevent future tragedies. Joseph Duncan's crimes were preventable. Every single one of them could have been stopped if the system had worked the way it was supposed to. He was a known offender with a documented history of violence going back to his teenage years. He confessed to multiple assaults when he was just 16 years old. Mental health professionals evaluated him and said he was too dangerous to be at large. And yet, he was released after just a few months. That was the first failure. He was convicted in 1980 for kidnapping and raping a child at gunpoint. He received a 20-year sentence. Doctors in the treatment program said he was unwilling to change his behavior, that treatment wasn't working. But he served only 14 years and was released on parole. That was the second failure. He violated parole multiple times. He was arrested again. He was sent back to prison. And then he was released again in 2000. That was the third failure. In 2004, he was arrested for molesting 2 children on a playground. He appeared before a judge who set bail at $15,000, a relatively small amount for such serious charges. Someone posted his bail. Duncan walked out of that courtroom and disappeared. That was the fourth failure, and that failure cost the Groene family everything. We need a justice system that takes crimes against children seriously. We need judges who understand that registered sex offenders with extensive criminal histories should not be granted bail when they're facing new charges. We need to recognize that recidivism rates for violent sex offenders, particularly those who target children, are extremely high. Rehabilitation is often impossible for people like Duncan. Public safety must come first. We need better monitoring of registered sex offenders. Duncan moved from state to state. He registered as required, but no one was actually monitoring what he was doing, where he was going, who he was around. He was able to travel to Idaho, surveil the Groene family for weeks, and plan an attack without anyone noticing. The registry system is only useful if we're actually using it to track and monitor dangerous individuals. We need better communication between jurisdictions. When Duncan was arrested in Minnesota in 2004, was anyone from Washington notified? Did anyone connect him to the unsolved murders of Carmen and Samuel? Did anyone look at his travel patterns and cross-reference them with unsolved crimes against children? Based on what we know, the answer appears to be no. Law enforcement agencies need to share information more effectively. We also need to listen. Duncan blogged about his intentions. He put his violent fantasies in writing on a public website. He wrote about his plans to kidnap, rape, and murder children. If anyone, had been monitoring him as a registered sex offender, if someone had read those blog posts and taken them seriously, if someone had alerted authorities that a convicted child offender was openly discussing plans to commit more crimes, the Groene family might still be alive. We can't ignore warning signs. We can't assume that people are exaggerating or seeking attention when they talk about violence. We have to take threats seriously. We have to act on information we have before it's too late. And we need to support survivors. Shasta Groene has been incredibly brave in sharing her story, but she shouldn't have to be. She should have been able to live a normal life, free from trauma. We need better mental health resources for survivors of violence. We need better support systems. We need trauma-informed care that helps people heal rather than re-traumatizing them. We need to recognize that healing is a lifelong journey and that survivors need ongoing support, not just in the immediate aftermath but for years and decades to come. There are some stories that stay with you long after you've heard them. Some cases that burrow into your mind and refuse to let go. The story of Joseph Edward Duncan and the lives he destroyed is one of those stories. It's a story about the worst of humanity, about evil that seems incomprehensible, about suffering that should never exist. It's about a system that failed over and over again, that gave a predator chance after chance to hurt more children. It's about families shattered by violence, about communities traumatized by unthinkable crimes, about the ripple effects of evil that touch countless lives. But it's also a story about resilience. It's about a little girl named Shasta who survived hell and came out the other side fighting. It's about communities that came together to search for missing children, to support grieving families, to demand justice. It's about law enforcement officers who worked tirelessly to bring a killer to justice, who bore witness to horrific evidence so that Duncan could be convicted. It's about everyday heroes like Amber Dean and Linda Olson, the waitress and manager who recognized Shasta and saved her life. It's about families who found the strength to face their grief in public, to advocate for change, to push for laws that might prevent other families from suffering the same fate. It's about a survivor who took her pain and turned it into purpose, who refused to let evil define her, who built a life for herself despite everything she endured. Joseph Edward Duncan is gone now. He died in 2021, defeated not by the justice system but by the cancer eating away at his brain. He can't hurt anyone else. He can't continue to seek attention and control the narrative. He's gone. But the scars he left behind remain. Shasta Groene still carries the weight of what she endured. The families of Carmen, Samieo, and Anthony still grieve their lost children. The Groene family was shattered in ways that can never be fully repaired. Steve Groene lost his partner Brenda, his son Slade, his son Dylan. He nearly lost Shasta too. That kind of loss doesn't heal. It becomes a part of you. You learn to live with it, but it never goes away. We remember these victims not because their suffering defines them, but because their lives mattered. They were real people with dreams and futures, and people who loved them. They deserved better than what they got. They deserved to grow up, to live their lives, to experience all the joy and pain and beauty that life has to offer. Brenda Groene deserved to see her children grow up, to become a grandmother, to grow old with someone who loved her. Mark Mackenzie deserved to build a life with Brenda, to be a positive influence in her children's lives. Slade deserved to finish high school, to discover who he was going to become, to fall in love and pursue his dreams. Dylan deserved to turn 10, to become a teenager, to experience all the messy, complicated, wonderful things that come with growing up. Carmen and Samieo deserved to come home that night, to grow up together as sisters, to live their lives. Anthony deserved to be celebrated for his bravery, to grow up knowing he saved his brother, to live a long and happy life. They all deserved better, and we, as a society, failed them. We remember Joseph Duncan not to glorify him or give him the attention he craved, but to remind ourselves that evil exists, that monsters walk among us, that we must remain vigilant, that we must protect the vulnerable, that we must never stop fighting for justice, that we must demand better from our systems, our institutions, our leaders. We remember this story because it teaches us hard truths, that some people cannot be rehabilitated, that the justice system makes mistakes, often with deadly consequences, that we must do better, that we must be willing to learn from our failures so that we don't repeat them. This is the story of Joseph Edward Duncan III, the devil in the wilderness, the predator who documented his own depravity and still managed to evade justice for decades, the monster who finally met his end on death row, defeated not by the system but by the cancer eating away at his brain. May his victims rest in peace. May their families find healing. May Shasta continue to thrive and build a beautiful life for herself. And may we never forget the lessons their stories teach us. If you or someone you know has experienced SA or violence, please reach out for help. You are not alone. There are resources available, people who care, ways to heal. The National SA Hotline can be reached at 1-800-656-4673. You matter, your story matters, and you deserve support. Take care of yourselves. Hug your loved ones a little tighter tonight. Lock your doors. Teach your children about stranger danger. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. And remember that even in the darkest places, even in the most horrific stories, there is still light to be found. There is still hope. There are still heroes. There are still survivors who refuse to be defined by the worst thing that ever happened to them. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all.